Do you believe that coincidences aren't coincidental? That evening, the three of us, me, Max, and Dan, were sitting in a half-empty pub on the very outskirts of the city. Outside the windows, a fine, nasty rain was lashing down, turning the street into a blurred gray mass of wet asphalt, dirty puddles, and a few dim streetlights. Inside it was warm, smelling of tobacco smoke and cheap malt, with quiet music playing. The evening dragged on so listlessly and boringly that all we wanted was to finish our cooling beer and head home. Max, as usual, decided to have some fun at my expense. "You're too much of a goody two-shoes, bro," he smirked, leaning back casually in his chair and twirling a lighter in his hands. "Your life is like a microwave manual, everything by the numbers." Dan gave a short laugh, taking a sip from his glass. I was about to fire back something sharp, but at that moment, a girl silently stopped beside our table. I don't know why, but the first thing that caught my eye was her deathly pallor. She looked as if she hadn't seen sunlight in months. Her thin fingers seemed unnaturally long and fragile, and her large gray eyes were completely empty and deep, like those of a gravely ill person. The girl introduced herself as Lena and carefully sat down beside us, barely touching the edge of the chair. But what was most unsettling wasn't even her appearance. She was terrified out of her mind. Her hands trembled in small, convulsive movements, and her gaze kept returning every second to the heavy front door of the pub, as if she expected someone to burst through it at any moment. "Please help me," she said quietly, almost soundlessly, looking up at us. "I need to get home right now. It's not far, about 20 minutes by car." With these words, Lena held out her phone to me. An old map was open on the screen. Amid a dense, unbroken forest, about 20 kilometers from the city limits, a single black dot blinked with no name or address. Max and Dan exchanged glances. Alcohol and boredom had done their work. "Sure, no problem." Max shrugged, brightening up. "We'll drop you off. Nothing else to do anyway." "Of course we'll drop you off. Sit down." Dan backed him up. Lena let out a breath of relief, but that relief lasted only a second. Then her gaze darted back to the door, and after that slid smoothly over to me. Right at me, directly. Something inside me turned unpleasantly at that look. In her eyes there wasn't just a request, there was panic. "Please," she said almost in a whisper, smoothing the words. "Just don't leave me here." For some reason, that particular phrase stuck in my memory more than anything else. 10 minutes later, we were already heading outside, huddling in our jackets under the icy rain. I took Megan off the alarm. Lena quickly got into the front passenger seat next to me, while Max and Dan, still loudly arguing about something, settled in the back. The headlights carved an empty road, glistening with moisture out of the pitch darkness. We pulled out of the parking lot. After driving a couple hundred meters, I automatically checked the rearview mirror. Max was in his seat, buried in his phone, and Dan sat next to him, looking out the window. Then my gaze slid to the right, to the neighboring passenger seat, and in that moment, my breath caught and a chill ran across my skin. The seat was empty, completely empty. There wasn't even a dent left in the gray fabric. Lena wasn't there, as if she had never opened the door and never gotten into this car. "Stop the car." "What the hell? Where did she go?" Dan screamed wildly from the back seat, leaning forward. I slammed on the brakes hard with a screech and jerked the wheel toward the shoulder. The car's nose dipped into the mud. We practically jumped out at the same time, throwing all the doors open. All around stretched only an empty wet highway, thick gray fog, and endless rain quietly, monotonously rustling on the tree branches. No trace of Lena, no silhouette of her in the darkness. Nothing. "Lena, cut it out. Come out," Max shouted into the darkness, but his voice instantly sank into the dampness. We ran around the car 3 times, lighting our way with our phone flashlights, checked every ditch by the roadside, but there wasn't a soul around. As if the girl had simply dissolved into thin air while the car was moving. When I got back into the car, I noticed that her phone had been left lying on the empty passenger seat. The screen was still glowing dimly, and the navigator was still stubbornly showing that same black dot in the middle of the dense forest. "So what do we do now?" Dan asked anxiously, wiping the rain off his face. She definitely forgot her phone. You can't get far in this fog. She'll freeze to death. Let's turn around and go to the police or something. What police, Dan? Max snapped irritably, jumping back into the back seat. What are you going to tell them? That a girl evaporated from a moving, locked car. We'll be the first ones locked up and left to stew until morning. Well, where are we supposed to go then? She's not here. Dan was starting to panic. We'll find this damn house on the map, give the phone to her family, explain the situation, and head back. Some beer night this turned out to be. I didn't like this plan from the start. Everything happening felt deeply wrong, unnatural. But the glowing screen of the stranger's phone in my hand was tempting. This gadget remained the only tangible thread that could somehow explain the madness that had just happened a minute ago. The dot kept blinking, as if calling to us. After a brief hesitation, I silently turned the key, started the engine, and Megan rolled forward along the washed-out, slick road leading away from the city. The further we drove into the outskirts, the thicker and heavier the fog became. Soon the headlights could barely pierce a couple of meters ahead of the hood, turning the world around us into an endless, dense gray wall. At the very first turn, the signal bars vanished from the dashboard. The connection was completely gone. Trying to launch a backup map on my phone, I found that the screen was behaving strangely. The map wouldn't load. The geolocation icon kept glitching erratically, and the route would appear and disappear, as if the device had suddenly gone insane. It was at that exact moment that a piece of old, thick paper flew out of the air vent right onto my lap. I nearly dropped the wheel in surprise. Unfolding the crumpled sheet under the dim cabin light, I read uneven, jagged words, written as if someone had traced them with a trembling hand in complete darkness. Don't trust the navigators. A tangible chill ran down my spine, and in that same second a strange, growing crackle came from the factory radio. The static grew louder and louder until it turned into a deafening metallic screech, after which the screen on the dashboard flickered and went completely dark, plunging the car into gloom. Almost immediately, the headlights caught an old, rotten wooden signpost on the roadside out of the fog. There wasn't a single letter or number on it, just a crooked arrow carved with a knife, pointing right toward where a narrow, overgrown dirt road began, leading straight into the thicket. At that exact moment, Megan's steering wheel jerked sharply and violently, painfully striking my fingers against the plastic spokes. The wheel sank into deep mud with a squelching sound. We were shaken violently over the ruts, and the clawing tree branches scraped across the roof with a terrifying screech, as if someone were dragging long, sharp fingernails across the metal. I threw my full weight onto the wheel, but the wheels seemed to have a life of their own. After a couple of kilometers, the engine gave a heavy wheeze and finally died. The silence fell so sharply and suddenly that it made my ears ring. All that could be heard was the heavy raindrops steadily drumming on the metal roof. On Lena's phone lying nearby, a short message glowed. Route completed. So, we're here? Dan asked uncertainly, his voice hoarse. Right in front of the windshield, among centuries-old trees, an enormous abandoned estate loomed. The ruined house looked like a gigantic, crumbling skeleton with shattered windows and a caved-in roof. Its stone walls darkened with dampness, almost blending into the night forest. A motionless silhouette stood on the rotten wooden porch. Lena was crying, her head lowered, and in the silence of the forest her sobs could be heard with frightening clarity. When we got out of the car, not a trace remained of our earlier excitement. It had been completely pushed out by a dull, sticky fear. Lena was shaking with large, unrelenting tremors. I didn't want to. I didn't call you. It's taking my voice on its own, she whispered lifelessly, slowly backing into the dark house. The front oak door stood wide open, and a crypt-like smell wafted from inside. We stood on the threshold, exchanging glances, but some alien force seemed to lead us forward, forcing us to cross the threshold. Inside it smelled thickly of mold, wet wood, and something sickly sweet, the smell of long-standing decay. In the center of the completely empty, dark hall stood a massive oak table. on which lay a single old, worn, leather-bound notebook. I opened it. The first pages were filled with neat, faded, male handwriting. March 14. I turned at the signpost. But within a few pages, the handwriting abruptly changed to a sprawling script, then to a jagged, hurried scrawl, as if dozens of different people had taken turns continuing the same damn story. At the very end appeared Lena's rounded letters. He made me call new ones. If you can hear my voice run, I can't control myself. The house is alive. It feeds. To get out, you need. The entry broke off at that word. What is this nonsense? Max roughly snatched the notebook from my hands. Lena, what the hell is this? He took a sharp step toward her, deeper into the hall, and at that exact second, the girl's body, like a puppet, jerked unnaturally backward, dragging her into the impenetrable darkness of the long corridor. Max rushed after her and dissolved into the gloom, and right behind our backs, the front oak door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Dan started yanking desperately at the wrought iron handle in a panic, but it seemed to have grown fused into the stone wall. Max, come back! I screamed at the top of my lungs, turning toward the corridor, but the only answer was dense silence. We rushed down the corridor, but the space seemed to have gone insane. The corridor never ended. We kept turning again and again, but each time we ended up back in the same place. Hundreds of footprints of people who had rushed around here long before us were imprinted in the thick layer of dust on the floor. Along the way, an old, mold-covered man's wallet turned up under my feet, and a little further on the floor lay a student ID torn in half, bearing someone else's name. The house had clearly been collecting its trophies long before our arrival. A bit further ahead, fresh sneaker prints from Max led to the only slightly open door. We literally burst into an empty room with boarded-up windows. Neither Max nor Lena was there, only our friend's shattered phone lay on the floor, its screen still glowing, displaying the last photo taken less than a minute ago. The photograph captured this very corner of the room. It was empty except for the pale flash glare in which a blurred human silhouette was clearly visible from behind. My silhouette. Someone had been standing right behind me in the dark, photographing me, while Max pressed the button. An icy, paralyzing cold ran down my spine, and the screen of the phone in my hands flickered briefly and went completely dark, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Dan, turn on your flashlight. Shine it here, I shouted, but in response I didn't even hear someone else's breathing. Out of anger and panic, I struck the case of my phone hard with my palm, and the screen reluctantly flared up, flooding the room with pale light. Dan was gone. No scream, no struggle, no sound of footsteps. He had simply dissolved into space behind my back, while the screen was dark. A dry, loud click sounded behind me. An enormous, darkened, antique clock without hands hung on the wall, its rust-covered pendulum swinging slowly and heavily to the right, producing a dull sound. Tick, tock, moo. Each beat resonated painfully, somewhere deep inside my skull. Beneath the clock stood a small wooden cabinet, on which lay that same familiar notebook again, and beside it rested a rusty pocket watch on a chain, a broken old photograph of an unknown family, a silver woman's locket, and a small toy car without wheels. Someone was methodically collecting here everything left behind by the people who had crossed the threshold. With trembling fingers, I opened the notebook to the very last page, where, in absolutely fresh ink, was written a message in my own, easily recognizable handwriting. The only chance is to go down into the basement when you hear 3 strikes, and don't look back. At that exact second, the antique clock burst into a deafening metallic chime. Boom. The stone walls trembled palpably. Boom. Thick, black shadows crept along the floor from the corners of the room. Right under my feet, a heavy wooden hatch leading to the basement burst open with a wild crack. Without another second's hesitation, I threw myself down the stairs. Halfway down the dark descent, Lena's crying voice came from above. Help! Out! I'm scared. Then Max's frightened voice joined it, followed by Dan's screaming. A moment later, they were speaking simultaneously, overlapping each other and turning into an eerie, unnatural chorus in which something mechanical, alien could be sensed. The voices grew closer, and then other voices began to sound, among them dozens, hundreds of new voices, male, female, children's whispering, crying, and screaming all at once, merging into one continuous swelling drone, as if this entire cursed house had spoken at once with hundreds of foreign mouths. The words written in my own hand flashed in my mind, and don't look back. I squeezed my eyes shut with all my might and ran down into the darkness. No, covering my ears with my hands, I bolted down the stairs without looking back, while behind me a heavy chaotic stomping of an enormous number of feet resounded. It seemed as though the entire horrific history of this place had broken loose and was rushing after me down the narrow staircase in an unstoppable flood. I literally flew onto the dirt floor of the basement, felt around for a heavy iron door, slammed it shut with all my strength, and convulsively slid the rusty bolt into place. In that same second, the metal shuddered with terrible force from hundreds of simultaneous blows from the other side, bulging inward as if everything that had ever died within these walls was trying to break through to me. I collapsed to my knees right onto the damp earth and pressed my head tightly with my hands. Gradually, the terrifying noise beyond the door began to subside, the blows becoming rarer and rarer until they vanished entirely, giving way to a dead, ringing silence. With trembling hands, I raised my phone, its screen glowing faintly down here. It was working again. Right in the center of the display glowed a short system message. Route updated, but there was no map anymore, only emptiness. An absolutely white field with no roads, landmarks, or borders. A digital dead end, lighting up the room with the pale glow of the screen. I finally looked around. The basement turned out to be quite small, and right in the center, on the dirt floor, stood an old, half-rotten wooden crate, on which lay, neatly placed, that same worn notebook, which had somehow ended up here before me. Scattered around the crate on the floor lay those very same items. A rusty pocket watch, a family photograph, a silver locket, and a plastic toy car without wheels. A final point, gathering up everything left behind by the people who had come here. I walked over and opened the diary to the last page. Fresh ink, my own handwriting. This house never releases those it has caught. There are no obvious villains here and no clear rules of exchange. It simply grinds us up, forcing us to write the same story over and over again. Lena, Max, Dan. Now their voices belong to this place, and I remain here, becoming part of its endless echo. Something inside my chest seemed to finally snap. I raised my eyes to the far, unlit corner of the basement, where a human figure stood, motionless, silent, too distant in the darkness for its face to be clearly made out. But every time I blinked, the image shifted imperceptibly, as if the faces of Lena, Max, and Dan were replacing one another in a mad kaleidoscope, smoothly flowing from one into another, as if someone invisible in the corner were desperately, convulsively trying to remember who exactly they had originally been. I stared at this figure for longer and longer, until a thought was born inside me that burned everything away and struck harder than any physical horror. I realized I was no longer even sure of one thing. What was my name? My name had been somewhere very close by just an hour ago. It had been loudly shouted in the pub, but I could no longer recall it, could no longer grasp the letters. My memory was completely blank. I don't remember what year it is, I said quietly into the darkness, and my own voice sounded foreign, unrecognizable. Lowering my eyes to my hands, lit by the white glow of the phone screen, I watched the skin on my fingers rapidly paling, losing pigment and becoming translucent. The fear and panic had completely faded, giving way to a cold, endless emptiness. An old pen lay next to the notebook on the crate. I reached out with a hand that had become weightless, picked it up, turned to a blank page, and carefully, with a steady hand, wrote out the very first line. March 14th. I am writing this so as not to lose my mind. Meanwhile, back in the city, in the cozy dimness of a warm pub, a loud, cheerful group of friends was sitting. They laughed loudly, drank beer, argued about some trivial, everyday nonsense, and had no idea that this rainy evening would be the very last normal evening of their lives. Outside the pub windows, the same fine rain drizzled on just as dismally as before. The heavy front door creaked open, and a pale young man, soaked through, walked in. He looked utterly lost and deathly tired, as if he had spent a very long time searching for the way back and had finally emerged among people. For a few seconds he simply stood lost on the threshold, looking around the room, then noticed the noisy group at the table and slowly headed straight toward them. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his lips moving with difficulty. Stopping at the edge of their table, "Could you give me a ride home? It's not far." About 20 minutes, and he held out his phone to them, on whose screen, amid an unbroken green expanse, a single black dot blinked ominously in the middle of the forest.